question for you, which might, I think some of my students will appreciate. We just wrote nonfiction essays. We've been, one of my classes is a multi-genre class. Actually, both of them are. So what we've sort of been, transitioning from poetry then to fiction, and now we're in the creative nonfiction mode. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, since you told me that you just finished a novel, if you could talk a little bit about sort of, the differences for you between writing creative nonfiction and fiction, because sometimes my students will conflate the two.
Sure, yeah. I mean, for me, it's a really different process, and I think fiction is much harder for me. I think because I'm an indecisive person in some ways, and there are infinitely more choices in fiction. I mean, there's sort of infinite choices in fiction, and I think for me, I do well when I know where the limits of something are in a way, and so I think nonfiction has it has a finite quality, right? Like the source material that you're drawing from, there are certain things about it that you can't change or that I'm not willing to change. And so you get sort of this raw material of what happened, right? And then for me, it's sort of, there's a puzzle quality to it, right? Because you're taking things out, you're adding things in, but you're also mainly just sort of working with the material and trying to form it into a shape that you recognize as sort of the thing that was calling to you to be made in the first place, And so I have a quote that I love that was Michelangelo said of sculpting, I saw the angel in the stone and I carved to set him free. And that's very much sort of speaks to my process of writing, especially nonfiction. I mean, all writing, but nonfiction where, I think that source material sort of wants to be in a certain shape, and it's my job to help it achieve that shape. And, the older you get, the more you trust when you recognize when it finds its shape, And with fiction, it's an analogous process, but for me it's slower, and it requires almost more faith in a way, I mean, and I always try to say this when I'm talking to students, but if you're finding the writing process really difficult and you feel really insecure, that's not a mark that you shouldn't be doing it. It's usually a mark that you are a writer, because that's always part of it. And for me, I think, the process of writing fiction, because it's a world that I am inventing, at least to a larger degree than in nonfiction, it requires that I believe in it to exist, right? It's like Tinkerbell or something. Like, it dies if I stop believing in it. And so the stakes seem higher in some ways. Like, I often picture sort of a circus tent, and like if I stop believing in the circus, like the tent collapses, right? And so that makes it a much scarier process for me, but when it's working, like when the aerialists are swinging, like it's more magical for me than nonfiction. So the stakes are higher, but it's a lot harder for me, I think. Whereas with nonfiction, if I lose faith in the project, like what happens still happens, so I can still sort of be pushing things around.
And you're still living.
Yeah, exactly. I'm still living. Like, my lack of faith can't erase what happened, So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah. How are you guys finding it? Writing the nonfiction?
Hard.
Yeah. What's hard about it?
Just to put everything down and describe it as it happened and make it seem like readable, like enjoyable to like not boring.
Yeah. Leave most of it out.
Yeah, totally. And actually, that's something that I think I always accuse my students of trying to drive me completely insane as I to an institution by not ever employing scenes, right? It's sort of like the narrative is just stretched over this long piece of time, and I'm like you're saying, leave a lot out, right?
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about sort of how a scene functions? Because I don't think I've really been very articulate about it. And then maybe you could talk about stanza.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I teach nonfiction, and I talk about every single class is writing scenes. And in some way, I think this goes back to sort of having faith in the world that you're creating, right? Because I think, I'll talk about it in a more technical way in a second, but I think if you have the urge to write about an experience of yours, like, there's something there, right? Like, it has a beating heart, and you can trust it. You don't have to prove to us in your introduction that it's worth us knowing about, and I think this is a really hard thing to do, but you can sort of trust the story. Like, tell us the story, and we'll get its value. Put us in that world, and we'll appreciate it. And I think what I'm constantly telling my students is, like, at least half of the time go through and just cut out the first few paragraphs, cut out the first page, because I think when we want to write nonfiction, we feel that pull to something, right? There's something rises to the surface of us. It's not a conscious process, but we feel like we need to know that it's worth writing about before we write about it. And so what we do is we sort of think on the page, and we try to figure out what the answer is, or what the lesson was, or what our wisdom about it is. But sometimes it's kind of an inchoate thing, and you have to tell the story to get to it. And I mean, I think you can be forgiving in that process. Like, I cut the first few paragraphs of every essay I write out, because it's just me finding my footing intellectually. Like, I need to pin down the ideas of it, and then I can throw them away and just tell the story, which is all the reader really cares about, you know? So, I mean, I often use sort of film analogies when I talk about scenes, you know? Like, nobody wants to go to a theater and sit in the dark and listen to voiceover. I mean, maybe if you're really into more experimental sort of video art. But if you go to see a film, like, you want to forget that you're sitting in this possibly bedbug infested seat, like watching something that took hours and hours and millions of dollars to make. You just want to forget all of that, and you want to be in the world of it, right? And that's what your reader wants to, if you're telling them a narrative story. And in order to do that, you have to sort of build the world around them, and you don't do that by talking to them. They could sit and have a conversation with you if they wanted that. You could write a speech, or you know, be a preacher. But if you want to tell a story, I think you have to just build the world. You have to describe what happened. You have to let your characters, even if they're based on real people, let them talk. Like, get your own voice out of it. I'm always writing no talkie in the margins of my students' work. Like, stop talking, talkie. Because they're always like trying to explain everything so that we have all the information we need. But what that does is it has you buzzing in our ear, and keeps reminding us that we're reading something instead of disappearing into the story. So yeah, scenes. And if you want to, you know, I think exposition has its place. You know, sometimes, and there's room in essays to explain things, but usually it's at the end. In the beginning, you just want to pull them in. And scenes are how you do that. Description. I just tell my students, go through the 5 senses and represent at least 3 of them. And go for smell. We're always going for sight.
You reminded of that. You always need to be reminded of that, even if you've been writing forever.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about feeling insecure. I think I don't trust writers who are like proud of their work. I'm always like, what's wrong with you? Because I think that if you're constantly growing and sort of living as a writer, you can't ever, your writing won't stay still enough to be good or bad or anything. Yeah. You're just like, what is it? Whatever it is, it could be better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, it's scary to start something and not have the answer or the thesis for what you're writing. But that's the only way to do it, because one, at least for me, if I already have the answer and I completely understand it, there's no reason for me to go through this sometimes excruciating process of writing about it, right? Like, I write to understand what my experiences have been, largely. So, and I think that if you start off already knowing what you think about everything, there's sort of like a self-satisfaction that I think the reader can pick up on, and it makes it less interesting. Like, I read to see people living and questioning and arriving at answers that I don't have myself, you know? And I think that's partly our job as writers, is to ask questions in a way where the stakes feel high when we're taking a risk, so other people can sort of watch us do that and arrive at their own answers. And so if you feel that shakiness at the beginning, you don't know where it's going, you don't have all the answers, that's where you should be. You know, you write, use that question as an engine.
So the line. Like we always say, you know, when we differentiate between poems and prose, it's like, okay, prose and paragraphs, but in poetry the unit is like the line, and then the line can be a stanza. So your poems, when we looked at the poem, one of your poems the other day, we were noticing how very shapely it was, and I don't think you can, you know, so, I mean, well, I think about poems that way, I really do. I think about poems sort of being, you know, when poems are not shaped nicely, I'm like, I feel sort of full of, like, I feel disgust. You know? So, but you have these really thin lines, and it was in that poem that we were talking about that you ended up not including in your book. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about sort of how what your relationship is to the line, to the stanza, and what excites you about, like, what you think a strong line is, you know. Because you're probably obsessed with the line.
Yes.
You know, like any poet.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about because like, and this sounds so obnoxious, but I often don't know how it happens.
Yeah.
Like,
so,
it's so, yeah, and instinctual, and like, I know when it's right, so that doesn't help anybody. But I think that the more you do it, the more you know the rhythm of the poems, and a lot of times I mean, I'll think that what I have written belongs on this really long line, and then like the poem is just not working, and what it needed was space around the words, and I think that's sort of where poetry is different from prose, because it's not all about just the words, it's about how they look on the page and also how they breathe on the page a little bit, and like the space around them. And sometimes the rhythms, I mean always the rhythms change based on where you're ending your line and where you're dividing up your stanzas. I don't really think of stanzas so much as individual scenes, although when I write poems in parts, those are meant to be individual scenes, but I think they give you a breath between the words, which I think is like not a literal breath, but it's not like a stage direction, but where you sometimes you want all the words all crowded up together and it really works, and sometimes you don't. And I think and it's just figuring out where in your own, like when you're writing a poem, where you divide things up is going to change it radically. And I don't really know how to say how to do that, because I'd have to see.
It's like creating an atmosphere. It's like creating
It's
weather.
yeah.
You know, I mean, it's all air and water.
Yeah, it's
you know,
all
it's just,
like
it composes itself.
it's a little bit
you know?
supernatural, which is also really
It really is.
gorgeous,
Yeah,
but,
it absolutely is.
But I think also what you were saying about like the cutting of line, like every poem I start, I cut like the first 3 stanzas, because it's all like, I'm having an intense feeling. And then I write the poem.
I am
and then
alone.
No one understands me. And then I like cut all that out, and then the poem happens. I think that's just warm-up, right? Like
Yeah, I always call it throat clearing.
Yeah, like you have
Well, it's
to
like
do
when
it.
my student, you know, I'm sure you guys know when Kate asks you to read something in class and you're like, oh, well, this is really just about this, and this is my coming of age story, and it's really bad, but I'm not really finished, and I don't know, and it's like, I forbid that in my class. Or if people do it too much, I start making them start off the readings by saying, this is amazing, prepare to be amazed, this is the best thing I have ever written, it is so effing good.
That was one of those.
But we have to. We like to sort of make ourselves comfortable while we gain our balance, you know, and we do it on the page too.
Yeah, I was one of those terrible students who was constantly apologizing for myself. In fact, when I wrote my acknowledgments in my book, my editor was like, you can't use these. You're like putting yourself down. I'm like, okay.
I'm sorry I wrote this book.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I always felt bad when people like, even when people buy my book and I'm signing, I'm just like,
so do I.
I'm like,
It's
it's
so
kind
awkward.
of a bummer.
Yeah.
This book's kind of a bummer.
Well, sometimes my students ask for apologies because I make them read so many depressing things. They're like, this is not nice of you. Why did you do this to us? It's a story. I was miserable all day.